Greetings, fellow members of the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Now, before I get started, did you know that you can get an official Esoteric Order of Gamers t-shirt at the Order of Gamers website? If you go to orderofgamers.com, there's a link there. You can buy yourself one of these fantastic t-shirts in multiple colours, and also you can buy mugs as well. Anyway, now that I've plugged that, let's get on to today's stuff, and today it's all about Solomon Kane by Mythic Games. Now I say all about, but actually today I'm going to be talking about painting because I'm still just playing Solomon Kane and getting to know it. I've played a two-player game and I've played a solo game, and I don't feel I've quite managed to just crack it yet. It's relatively complex and there's a lot of kind of fiddly bits to keep track of. There's some really interesting stuff going on. There's a dice management system. It approaches the whole idea of running the characters from Solomon Kane in a very different way from normal games. You don't just play a single character, you all play the virtues who are influencing the main character of Solomon Kane. Very interesting approach, and I will be discussing it a lot more in future after I played a few more games and got to know it even better. But before we get to that, let's get on to painting some of the beautiful figures in this set. The miniatures are really nice, they've got lots of character and they're easy to paint. The only trick with painting these ones is there's not a whole lot of reference online for colour schemes, so you might have to come up with your own colour schemes. I can give you some suggestions today and also show you how I've been painting up the figures so far. We won't cover all of them, of course, because there are so many in these two sets. This is the main set and this is the extra arsenal box that you get through Kickstarter. There's heaps and heaps of miniatures, but let me guide you through painting enough miniatures to play your first game. Right, let's get started with some of the really easy stuff and do some of these tokens first, the turn order tokens and the compass rose, etc. And for these, I'm not going to muck around too much. I want something simple and effective, and I've used this technique before, and that is to start off with some Rune Lord brass. Use that as a base coat. I'll just paint the whole of the token straight from the pot, and make sure that paint doesn't pull too much in the recesses. You can dab it out so you don't lose any of that detail. And then I'll use the same for the turn order tokens as well. Once that's thoroughly dry, give the Rune Lord brass a wash with Agrax Earthshade. And do the same for the turn order tokens. I'll then use a Baden Black to paint in the numerals on the turn order tokens. Using Stormhost Silver, I do some small highlights on the Rune Lord brass. Just a few around the edge. On the compass rose, I'm going to highlight all the raised areas with Stormhost Silver. Here's the silver on the rose. I'm going to give this a little bit more Agrax Earthshade over the silver. Just a little bit. And then just wipe most of it off. I just want a little suggestion. Finally, on the brass, a little bit of Nicklac oxide. And this just goes into some of the recesses, just to give a little suggestion of oxidization. You can rub some of it off with your finger if it's too much. Or a paper towel. This just makes it look a bit old and tarnished. There we go. And a little bit on these as well. Just be subtle with this. I'm going to paint these spawn tokens black because I'm going to dry brush them purple after that. So you can either
prime them in black, or just paint them over in black, as I'm about to do, using a Baden black. Now I'm going to dry brush these spawn tokens with Xerius purple. So wipe most of that off on a paper towel and just build up the purple colour. This will take a few coats because it's going from quite a dark colour, black, to another dark colour. So that's fine for a first coat. Let that dry and then do another one. I'll dry brush them with a bit of Genestealer purple and then add a little bit of white to that and get very subtle with the dry brushing as I go to white. Just concentrating the dry brush in the centre of the swirling texture in the middle and on the outside edges as well. Then using white scar, I'll carefully paint in the numerals. This might take a couple of coats. Actually, they're not numerals, they're X, Y, and Z. And with watered down Abaddon black, just go around the edge of the letter, outlining it. If necessary, you can go back and touch up the white. Next, I want a base colour for each of these counters that go on the main track, the Strength, Clarity, Compassion and Danger track. So I'm using Corn Red for Strength, Cabalite Green for Clarity, Avalanche Sunset for Compassion, and Macraga Blue for Danger. For these tokens, I'm going to wash the red one with Seraphim Sepia, the yellow one with also the same Seraphim Sepia, the blue one with Drakenhof Nightshade, and the greenish one with Athonian Camo Shade. For the tokens, I carefully paint in the symbols and the edge with highlight colours. Mephiston Red for this one. I mix white with Avalanche Sunset for this one. You can see I've already painted that in. Very carefully, especially those fine lines with a small brush. For the Cabalite Green, I'll mix a little bit of the Avalanche Sunset into it. And for the blue, I'll use a lighter blue, probably something like Teclis Blue. I've just added some very tiny highlights to that, very rough, but little highlights to those colours, just to make them pop a little bit more, just on the edges. Added a bit of white to the yellow there, a little bit yellow, a bit of yellow to that, a bit of white to that, a bit of yellow to that, just to get little highlight colours. So there you go, our painted counters for Solomon Kane, and as you can see they look a lot better than the plain plastic. Let's start painting a shadow. Now there are 6 of these, and I've started with a base coat of a mix of Dryad Bark and XV88, about a 1-to-1 mix of those. That gives me a nice dark leathery brown, and I've just painted the whole figure with that, using a large brush. I then dry brush the shadow with Talon Sand. Then a light dry brush of a Shabti Bone, just on the top areas of the figure. Now I'm using Agrax Earthshade just to highlight the areas of stitching and also some of the shadow areas underneath the cowl and some of the darker shadow areas. Then contrast Black Templar. I'll just paint in the cowl and where the arms would be in the cowl, And I can use a bit of water just to blend this into the area around it. Also reinforce some of the shadow while I'm there. Now I use Xerius Purple, and just using a very small brush, an old brush like this, I'm going to get a bit of paint, wipe a little bit of it off, and just do a semi kind of dabby dry brush in there into the cowl. I'll wipe off any excess that goes outside the cowl and in the armholes here, and just fill that with a bit of purple and drag it down there a bit. There we go. And I'll just continue to use lighter shades of purple to highlight that up to little dots of almost white. And there are my finished nightmares. Very simple and easy to do, but looking quite effective. For Solomon Kane himself, I'm using a mixture of Steel Legion Drab and a Batten Black. Rather than just straight black, I thought I'd make his robes a kind of dirty, dark brown instead. There's the base coat. And then I've painted in some details. Retributor armour, skeleton horde on these skulls, Cadian flesh tone on his flesh, and a bit of black Templar to darken the shadows. I washed the flesh with Seraphim Sepia, and also the sword hilt, and the metals with Nuln oil. Using glossed Nuln oil is usually better for washing silver. Now I'm going to start painting in some little highlights with a fine brush, just to make those that dark clothing pop a bit. I've just added white to my base mix, and I'm doing some very small highlights. Concentrate on places like tops of the boots, the cuffs of the jacket, just areas that would catch the light a bit. Then of course some highlights just on the very top edges of the folds of the cloak. And there you go. Now I'm going to deepen some of those shadows again with Nuln oil. Doesn't have to be gloss Nuln oil this time. Just go back and define some of those shadows. You can also see I've mixed a bit of white with my flesh tone just to highlight the bits of flesh that are showing, especially the knuckles and the tip of the chin and nose. And here's our hero Solomon Kane, all completely finished. Now he's quite grey. I could have gone a bit more black with his outfit, but I kind of like this effect because it looks a bit more travel worn and travel stained. So you could go darker if you like. I just decided that I quite like this look. There's just some bone areas highlighted up with the Shabti bone, and a little snake coming out of there, and then just a mixture of greys and greens in there highlighted. The bases are all interesting to do. There's a lot of detail in them and they're really nice. Now, of course, the main feature of Solomon Kane are the virtue figures, and they may seem quite daunting at first. They're all rather detailed and they're large figures, and you may think, oh, how am I going to paint these? Well, I really liked the official paint jobs that have been done of these. Here's an example. They're beautifully done, and there's a lot of careful blending on there and a lot of work. I wanted this effect, but I didn't want to spend as much time as has obviously been spent on those. So I played around, and this is my test figure, and I'm quite happy with the results. And this uses a mixture of contrast paints and then some highlighting done by hand and some painted in by hand. But the main colour that I'm using is Contrast Achelian Green. I don't know why it's green, because it's very much a turquoise rather than a green. But this is a great colour for this basic colour here, even though after I painted it on I gave it a thin coat of Drakenhof Nightshade just to make it a little bit more blue. And then some of the lighter areas, the bluey turquoise areas, I've actually painted in by hand using Temple Guard blue mixed with a bit of white scar, and then I started doing some hand highlighting there and highlighting up the contrast areas by hand. And if you have a nice contrast between the skin and the drapery, you can see it works really well. There's some brown areas, the belt and ties there. They're just painted with dryad bark, highlighted with Gawthor brown. And, then various grey areas for these extra bits and things like that. So you can see while areas like this, there's just the contrast shading. I've done extra highlighting on some of these pleats just to make them stand out more. A little bit of light highlighting on there. So it's a mixture between being a quick paint job, but also with some hand-done highlighting as well. And I think this comes out quite well. So let me just show you as I paint on some of this contrast paint. And you can be quite generous on your brush and just sort of dab it on. The thing with using contrast paint is just to control it a little bit, pretty much like a wash. So you can put it on quite heavy, and then make sure you don't have it pooling heavily in shadow areas. You can push the paint around a little bit. You can wipe it off highlight areas. Just control it, move it around with your brush until you're happy with the way it's settling on the figure. You can see it'll look a bit messy when it's first applied, but as it dries, it'll look better. So let's have a look at these so far. So this is the one I've already showed you, which I've taken to pretty much finished level. I've got a bit more work to do on the base and a little bit of detailing, but this sort of general area is pretty much done, and this is how I'm going to be doing all of the Virtue figures. Now, I was thinking about this last night and my way of working, and I realised that one of the things I like to do is get paint on a figure. I just like to get all the base colours on there and then refine it to the level of detail that I want to do, or that I'm happy with. So what I did is go through the other figures and just get those base colours on. So you can see I've used that contrast paint on what I want to be the sort of darker areas of fabric. So they're the main areas of fabric. Here for this sash, I've used Stegodon Stale Green, and that gives a nice darker contrast. And then for these golden areas, I've used a mix of Retributor Armour. Here it is here, and Ironbreaker. And that gives me a sort of toned down gold effect. So just with those few different tones, you can get some nice bits of contrast there. On the base, there's Storm Vermin Fur for the columns. And then for this light blue area, and this is just the first go at this, I've used Lothern Blue. There's also some dryad bark and some of these brown areas and these straps. So you can see this is all base coated, and then I can go back and add some washes to the gold and everything and refine it further. But the good thing about doing this kind of thing is when you've got to this stage, you can still play some games and it looks okay on the tabletop, but then you can go back and refine it further. But I'm going to spend the day refining these more. Here's the Justice figure, similar kind of thing, and I put all these on pretty much at the same time, so there are bits where they bleed into each other. You can see a bit of the blue contrast paint has gone onto the gold of the shield, like that. And in a way, this sort of makes it a bit more interesting. It blends colours together a little bit, so you don't have to worry if they're a bit wet when you're doing this. By the way, down there for the figures, I used Wildwood. So it's not necessarily a super clean pass. Little bits of colour may bleed into each other, but when you do that, you might get some nice effects. A bit of blue going into the gold there. And the thing is, as I said before, when you go back into it and clean up all the detail, you can fix those things if you want to. For the meantime, we've got some nice base colours. Here's Prudence. I just painted on the Lothern blue onto the hands and feet and face, but the rest of that is pretty much contrast paint with the Stegodon scale green for the rest of this. And as you can see, a lot of detail work to be done in here if you want to make that all perfect. This one is Courage. Again, same colours. And for the moment, I've just got that contrast paint all over this area, but I will be detailing some of this armour and making this much more detailed. This is just very much a first go. But you can see what I mean in that it takes away that fear of the unpainted parts of the mini. You're not spending ages and ages on one arm, getting it perfect and then moving to the next arm and everything. It's more of an overall approach, slapping down the paint, covering up all the unpainted areas, and then going back and refining that step by step to whatever level you want to go to. Here's another perfect example. This is the darkness figure, and in great contrast it's using browns. And I've used Scrag Brown for the lighter brown and Dryad Bark for the darker brown. For those flesh areas, Fenrisian Grey. And then once that was done, and I painted these armour areas with Lead Belcher, I just coated most of it in Agrax Earthshade. Seraphim Sepia over this kind of gold necklace, but everything else was Agrax Earthshade. And you can see for darkness it's already looking fine for tabletop use, but you could go in and do lots of extra detail and highlighting. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that my approach is not to take an element of a figure and paint it in perfect detail and then move on to the next element. Slap some paint on your miniatures, cover up all those unpainted areas, then do your washes to define those painted areas, and then go back in level by level, adding more detail and highlighting as you go. So I'm going to do some more detailing on all of these, and we'll have a look at them when that's done. And I'll show you what I've done to make these paint jobs look even better. So here are all the miniatures for the Right Hand of Doom scenario, and of course all the virtues as well. One of the good things about the game is that you can just paint up the figures you need for each scenario or set of acts, and then play with those, and then do the next chunk. You don't have to do them all in one go. Now let's have a look at the virtues. This is of course temperance, and just a little bit more detail and highlighting, but I haven't gone crazy with the highlighting. A little bit of detail on the base there with those vines, and a bit of highlighting on the jugs. And of course it's always good to give a bit more attention to the face area as well, because it's the focal point of the miniature. Next up, Dear Prudence. Again, just keeping the highlighting to the highest raised areas, and a little bit of work on all those little scales and everything, but I haven't gone crazy and tried to paint everything or highlight everything. There's a bit of just straight silver highlighting there too on the embroidery. This one is Justice, and mainly the brown belts and the Retributor Armour Lead Belcher mix for all the little metallic areas. It just adds a nice bit of detail. Some very high highlights on the cloak. And you really just let all the detail do the work. Again, Justice has some nice metallic details that make the figure interesting. There's the base with some rough highlights, and some highlights on the sash and the cloak. This is Courage. Remember, when highlighting these gold areas, you use silver to highlight the gold. And I've really used the Seraphim Sepia wash on the gold to do most of the work of bringing out the detail with just a little silver highlight. And finally, Darkness. And just highlighting of the browns here. I didn't get too detailed in those figures down at the base. Just highlighting of all the stitching actually makes this look a bit more interesting. You can use a Shabti bone to highlight the stitching. Okay, let's have a quick look at some of the character figures. And you can just see I've come up with some very simple colour schemes for these. Just blue and red are kind of a popular colours for the time. I actually looked online at some colours for the late 16th century, early 17th century. Apart from that, just simple greens and browns, nothing too bright or rich looking, because remember most of these are just kind of village characters and bandits and things like that. Pretty simple base coats, washes and quick highlights. They're nice and easy to paint, these figures, very clear detail. This is a fun one, the right hand of Doom. I've also used contrast paints for things like stone and wood. Thanks very much for watching, folks. I hope this was useful, and check out the Solomon Kane rules summary and reference on my website at orderofgames.com.